The room didn't erupt when the decision landed. There were no gasps, no dramatic reactions, no instant outrage. What followed was far more unsettling. Silence. The kind of silence that signals something irreversible has just happened. Because this wasn't a fine. It wasn't a restriction. It wasn't even a forced restructuring. The ruling amounted to something far more extreme, a declaration that a corporate entity had crossed a line so fundamental that it no longer deserved to exist. Not to be corrected, not to be monitored, to be dismantled. For years, Donald Trump built his public identity on a single claim, that he was the ultimate businessman, a deal maker who understood value, leverage, and power better than anyone else. His brand wasn't just political, it was commercial mythology. Towers, golf courses, licensing deals, all wrapped into one message: success without limits. That mythology now collided with a very different language, not slogans, not loyalty, not ideology, documentation. What makes this moment extraordinary isn't the scale of the assets involved, it's the reasoning behind the judgment. Courts don't reach for dissolution lightly. It's considered the corporate equivalent of capital punishment, used only when regulators conclude that fraud isn't incidental but structural, not accidental but deliberate, not correctable but baked in. According to the findings that led here, the issue wasn't one or two inflated valuations, it was a pattern, numbers that shifted depending on the audience, statements tailored not to reality but to convenience. One version for lenders, another for insurers, another for tax authorities, each internally inconsistent, yet all pointing in the same direction: intent. This is where Trump's usual playbook failed him. Attacking prosecutors is one thing, dismissing lower courts as biased is another. But when the ruling comes from the top, especially from judges he once counted as ideological allies, the narrative collapses. The witch hunt frame stops working when the hunters refuse to act like hunters at all. Inside Trump's circle, the reaction wasn't unified rage, it was calculation, because a dissolved corporation doesn't just disappear symbolically, it triggers timelines, liquidation processes, oversight, third-party control. It invites scrutiny not just of past behavior, but of every remaining asset still connected to the brand. That's why this moment rattled Wall Street more than Washington. Markets don't care about loyalty, they care about precedent. And the precedent being set here is uncomfortable, that even a politically dominant figure can lose everything when fraud reaches a certain threshold. That courts may tolerate gray zones, but not fabricated realities. This is where Warren Buffett's reaction mattered. Buffett has spent decades avoiding political entanglement. His credibility comes from discipline, restraint, and a near-religious respect for transparency. When someone like that breaks silence, it isn't commentary, it's signaling. And the signal was simple. This wasn't persecution, it was consequence. From that moment on, the conversation changed, not just about Trump, but about corporate accountability itself. Executives watching from a distance began asking a dangerous question. If this can happen here, where else could it happen? And that's the real power of a decision like this. It doesn't just punish one entity, it recalibrates behavior across an entire system. Politically, the fallout is still unfolding. Trump can attack judges, he can attack institutions, he can frame this as betrayal, but he can't undo the core damage, the erosion of the one credential he's relied on more than any other, the image of invincibility. A businessman can survive scandals. A politician can survive indictments, but when the story becomes that your empire itself was ruled too dishonest to continue operating, the ground shifts. Supporters may stay loyal, critics may feel vindicated, but undecided observers see something else entirely: collapse under scrutiny. This isn't about buildings, it's about trust. And once trust is legally revoked, no rally, no post, no outrage campaign can restore it. What happens next won't be cinematic. It will be procedural, quiet, methodical, assets assessed, control transferred, brands unraveled. And that quiet dismantling is precisely what makes this moment historic. Because power doesn't always fall in flames. Sometimes it dissolves, line by line, signature by signature, until there's nothing left to defend. What comes next isn't chaos, it's exposure. Once a corporate dissolution process begins, attention shifts away from personalities and toward paper trails. Independent managers step in. Auditors stop assuming good faith. Every contract, every valuation, every transfer gets re-examined without deference to reputation. And that's where things tend to unravel fastest, not in courtrooms, but in spreadsheets. For Trump, this phase is uniquely dangerous. His brand has always relied on control, controlling the narrative, the valuation, the perception of success. Dissolution strips that control away. Decisions move into the hands of professionals who have no political stake and no incentive to protect the myth. Their mandate isn't loyalty, it's accuracy. Inside the Republican ecosystem, the shock is already producing fractures. Some allies are doubling down, framing the decision as proof that institutions are irredeemably hostile. Others are quietly recalculating distance because there's a difference between defending a controversial figure and defending a business that courts have formally labeled fraudulent. One is ideological, the other is reputational poison. Donors feel this distinction immediately. Political contributions are optional. Association risk is not. The moment corporate dissolution for fraud becomes part of a candidate's permanent record, risk managers start asking questions that no speech can answer. Can this person attract litigation, regulatory scrutiny, unpredictable exposure? For financiers, uncertainty is worse than opposition. This is where Trump's strategy runs into a wall. Escalation no longer helps. Attacking the court doesn't change the process. Threatening institutions doesn't restore credibility. And portraying oneself as a victim stops working once the remedy isn't symbolic but terminal. You can claim persecution when you're fined. It's harder when your organization is legally declared unfit to operate. There's also a longer shadow forming: precedent. Executives across industries are watching closely, not because they sympathize with Trump, but because they recognize the implication. Aggressive fraud, if documented thoroughly enough, can still trigger extreme consequences. For years, white-collar enforcement has been accused of being toothless. This ruling challenges that assumption, and that makes a lot of powerful people uncomfortable. Politically, the implications bleed into 2024 and beyond. Trump's appeal has always blended defiance with dominance, but defiance without dominance looks different. It feels reactive, smaller, more brittle. Voters who once admired the image of control may begin to see instability instead, and instability is the one thing institutions, markets, and moderate electorates consistently reject. The irony is that this moment didn't require an election loss, a criminal conviction, or a dramatic scandal. It required patience, documentation, and a system willing to follow its own logic to the end. Even when that end was unprecedented, Trump will fight. That's inevitable. He'll appeal in public even when appeals no longer exist. He'll frame this as a political purge. He'll demand loyalty and punish dissent. But those moves speak to survival, not recovery. They don't rebuild trust. They don't reverse dissolution. They only harden lines. And in the background, quietly, methodically, the dismantling will continue. Because once a system decides that an entity cannot be corrected, only removed, the outcome stops being a debate. It becomes a process. No spectacle, no rally can interrupt it. No outrage can shame it into retreat. Just procedure. And in modern power struggles, procedure is often the most decisive force of all. As that process moves forward, something subtle but irreversible begins to happen. Trump stops being the center of the story. The narrative shifts from personality to mechanism, from speeches to filings, from rallies to registries. That's the most dangerous transition for someone whose power has always depended on attention and dominance. Systems don't argue, they execute. Liquidators don't care about legacy, they care about assets. Titles, licensing agreements, branding rights, management contracts, all of it gets reduced to line items. Properties once marketed as symbols of success become liabilities to be priced, sold, or unwound. The Trump name, once treated as a multiplier, is suddenly evaluated as a risk factor. That alone marks a psychological turning point that no press release can undo. Behind closed doors, former partners begin to reassess old decisions. Banks review exposure they assumed was settled. Insurers reopen files they thought were closed. Counterparties who once relied on handshake confidence start checking indemnity clauses. This is how reputational collapse actually spreads, not through headlines, but through quiet recalculation. Inside Trump's inner circle, the pressure intensifies. Loyalty becomes expensive. Silence becomes suspicious. Anyone who signed documents, approved valuations, or forwarded numbers now has to consider whether proximity is protection or liability. History shows that at this stage, cohesion fractures. People don't flip because they want to. They flip because the cost of staying loyal exceeds the cost of telling the truth. Politically, the messaging problem grows sharper by the day. Trump can argue that courts are biased. He can argue that regulators are hostile, but he can't argue that dissolution is normal. Voters may tolerate controversy. They don't tolerate finality. Once something is declared unfixable, it changes how every prior claim is reinterpreted. Past boasts begin to sound like warnings that were ignored. There's also a generational effect at play. Younger voters, investors, and professionals don't see Trump as a rebel against elites. They see him as someone who tested the limits and finally ran out of leverage. In an era obsessed with accountability, real or performative, that perception matters. It reframes him not as an outsider, but as an example. None of this requires a single dramatic moment, no perp walk, no televised arrest, just time. Time for processes to complete, time for documents to surface, time for allies to distance themselves quietly, time for the story to move on without him controlling it. And that may be the most destabilizing consequence of all. Because Trump's greatest strength was never money or law or institutions. It was narrative control, the ability to dominate the frame, define the terms, and keep everything orbiting around him. Dissolution breaks that orbit. It decentralizes attention. It turns a man into a case study. What remains is a long procedural unwinding, one that doesn't need to convince anyone. It simply proceeds. And when it's over, there will be no dramatic ending. No single moment to point to and say, that's when it ended. Just a quiet recognition that something once powerful no longer exists. Not because it was defeated in a fight, but because it failed an audit of reality. That's how systems win. Not loudly, not emotionally, but permanently. And once permanence sets in, even resistance begins to lose its edge. Outrage depends on the belief that something can still be reversed. Appeals, protests, denunciations, they all assume there's a lever left to pull. But dissolution doesn't offer levers. It offers timelines, deadlines, transfers, closures. It's bureaucracy at its most final. This is the phase where symbolism collapses. A brand that once stood for excess and dominance becomes a legal remnant. Logos get detached from owners. Properties change hands without ceremony. Employees receive notices that contain no politics, only instructions. The machinery doesn't gloat. It doesn't punish emotionally. It simply reallocates. For Trump, that creates a paradox he's never faced before. He can still command crowds. He can still dominate headlines, but none of that restores operational reality. Influence without infrastructure is performance. And performance without consequence eventually exhausts itself. What's striking is how familiar this pattern looks to historians of power. Not the fall of empires through conquest, but through internal contradiction. When systems built on exaggeration finally encounter systems built on verification, the outcome is rarely dramatic. It's administrative. Ledgers replace speeches. Compliance replaces charisma. This doesn't mean Trump disappears. Figures like him rarely do. They linger as symbols, rallying points, grievances made flesh. But symbols without assets operate in a different register. They can inspire, but they can't execute. They can accuse, but they can't enforce. Over time, even followers sense the difference. Meanwhile, institutions absorb the lesson quietly. Regulators learn that escalation works when it's methodical. Courts learn that restraint followed by resolve preserves legitimacy. Corporations learn that the shield of celebrity isn't infinite. And future actors, watching from boardrooms and campaign offices, adjust behavior accordingly. That may be the most enduring outcome. Not the collapse of one empire, but the recalibration of expectations. The reminder that scale doesn't equal immunity, that repetition doesn't equal truth, that eventually numbers have to add up. Trump's story will continue because personalities always outlast structures in the public imagination. But this chapter closes differently than the others. There's no reset button, no rebrand powerful enough to overwrite a judicial conclusion, no counter-narrative that restores dissolved entities, only aftermath. And in the aftermath, what remains isn't the noise, the anger, or even the spectacle. It's precedent, quiet, boring, enforceable precedent, the kind that doesn't trend, but changes behavior long after the cameras move on. Dальше, and precedent has a way of traveling faster than outrage ever could. Long after supporters stop arguing about motive and timing, lawyers start citing outcomes, compliance officers rewrite internal rules, banks quietly tighten underwriting standards. Auditors become less flexible, not because they suddenly grew moral consciences, but because risk models update. What once looked like an exception becomes a data point. This is where the real shift happens. Not on television, not in rallies, not even in elections. It happens in spreadsheets, in legal memos, in boardroom conversations that never make headlines. The Trump Organization's dissolution doesn't live as a political story inside those spaces. It lives as a cautionary case, and caution spreads. Executives who once believed aggressive valuation was just how business works begin asking different questions. Attorneys who previously pushed boundaries now advise restraint. Not because they fear prison tomorrow, but because they understand trajectory. Once courts demonstrate they're willing to follow evidence all the way to its logical conclusion, the cost-benefit analysis changes. That's why this moment matters beyond Trump himself. For decades, white-collar accountability in America has been uneven. Punishment often stopped at fines. Corporations paid, rebranded, and moved on. Individuals rarely faced structural consequences. Dissolution was theoretical, something reserved for history books and antitrust lectures, until it wasn't. Once that line is crossed, it doesn't get erased. It becomes available. Future prosecutors don't need to invent a new tool, they just need to justify using an existing one. And judges, now armed with precedent, don't need to worry they're venturing into uncharted territory. That alone alters behavior at the margins, which is where most misconduct actually lives. For Trump, this creates a strange legacy inversion. He built his identity on dominance, on winning, on proving that rules bend for those bold enough to push them. But what remains may be the opposite lesson, that relentless escalation eventually invites a response that doesn't negotiate. No deal, no settlement, no workaround, just termination. And that's why the emotional reactions, the anger, the betrayal narratives, the accusations, ultimately fade. Systems don't argue back. They wait, they document, they accumulate. And when they act, they do so in ways that feel disproportionate only to those who mistook tolerance for weakness. In the end, this isn't about morality, it's about structure. A structure that allowed excess for years. A structure that finally corrected itself, and a structure now recalibrated for whoever comes next. Trump will remain a political force as long as people choose to follow him, but the business world operates on different incentives. It follows enforceability, not loyalty, outcomes, not narratives, and in that world, this chapter is already closed. What comes next isn't spectacle. It's adaptation, quiet, incremental, irreversible, the kind of change that doesn't announce itself, but reshapes the landscape all the same.